part of our look at style this week, we're going to focus on Neoclassicism and the Greek Revival in the American Republic. This is a very famous style and one that's very much associated with the American landscape. So much so that if you recognize these things, from the White House in the U.S. Capitol to a local Baptist church or the courthouse in downtown Decatur, as well as maybe dining room chairs in your house or another's house, or for sale, or just common houses around a neighborhood. When you see these things, you're seeing neoclassicism at work. And I think, as we sample this, we can see that it's a very dominant style in the United States. And there's historically specific reasons for that. It's also an interesting case study in style because it's a very distinct style and one that we can examine and identify fairly readily. The neoclassical style has its roots in Europe and was probably first adopted in France and had there, as well as here, associations with post-revolutionary states. The neoclassical style sweeps across all forms of material life in the United States during the early years of the Republic. And you can kind of see that embodied in this print. We see this in public buildings, such as the Waterworks in Center Square in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is one of the main areas where this kind of architectural style really takes root in the early Republic. In some cases, it's mapped onto the Georgian style of building. So here we see the addition of pediments, little porch porticos, incorporated into a Palladian design in Carpenter's Hall, or in some of these federal era buildings in Massachusetts. We also see this style proliferate across a wide variety of public buildings. Here we have the medical school in Philadelphia in 1800 and the Bank of the United States on 3rd Street in Philadelphia, as well as the Waterworks. We also see neoclassical sensibilities in dress, what we might call the Empire style in the French context, but is a kind of straight up a Grecian-inspired neoclassicism in the U.S. And it's really dominant from like the 18 teens up through the early 1830s. We see neoclassical motifs and styles in furniture, and these next few examples are actually examples from the reading that you had from the Rosemary Krill. These are the actual artifacts in the collections at Winterthur. The Secretarian bookcase, and you can see, if you want to get a sense of the style, here is an early neoclassical dressing table, and we see how it's contrasted here on the left with the former 18th century Chippendale style, and we can kind of see those kind of like lean lines and slender legs and so forth that she associates with the style. Here's our old friend, the card table, and you can see this is specifically a neoclassical card table. Work table, we see it in chairs, in dining room furniture, and in particular, we also see the emergence of specific neoclassical motifs. So here we have on this chair back the Grecian urn. Here we have a knife box from the turn of the 18th to 19th century that is in the shape of a Grecian urn. We also see associated with neoclassicism in the United States, especially during the early Republic, Roman imagery, which is no accident since the Roman Empire was one of the models for the early Republic. So we have in calls to the national shield, the Roman eagle, as in the case of this looking glass and dressing box. And then we also see these kind of Roman symbols merged with Greek symbols, a kind of combination democracy or republic and empire in one. Neoclassicism finds its fullest expression in the U.S. in the Greek Revival, which we see predominantly in architecture and furnishings. And this is considered the first national style in the United States, in part because it is tied to the creation of nationalist ideology in the early years of the Republic, but also it becomes a style that is across every region of the United States. So it's the first architectural style that has no regionally specific manifestation. We can find it everywhere. So let's just talk a little bit, first of all, about what constitutes the Greek Revival style. There are certain components that we would identify, and in the supplementary readings for this week, there are some materials there related to terminology and architectural terms if you want to get in deep with this. But at the very least, we can recognize that Greek Revival architecture has a low-pitched gable or hip roof, and one of the really distinct features is the front-facing gable with the triangular pediment. And you see this very literally and then also very abstractly in a wide variety of Greek Revival architecture. We see a wideband trim at the cornice line of the roof, or what's called an entablature, often with a cornice, a frieze, and an architrave. Sometimes you just have the cornice. Sometimes you don't have the full entablature. But in a lot of public buildings, we definitely see that. We also see the use of porticos, entry porches, and square or rounded columns. So we might have an Ionic or Doric columns holding up the front portico, or we might see on the facade of the building a flattened representation of a pillar in the form of a pilaster. We often also see elaborate door surrounds, which you saw in the prior slide. Also, Greek Revival architecture is almost invariably painted white or gray to imitate the marble of Greek temples, or what they thought Greek temples looked like. We now know that, in fact, many of them were painted colorfully. But I think that white also has another component, which I'll mention in a little bit. And we see this both in the kind of white pillars of the Greek Revival temple, as well as the white clapboard houses that become very popular during this period. So the pedimented gable, the symmetry, a heavy cornice, simple moldings, entry porches, decorative pilasters. These are all things that we can identify as being very much part of the Greek Revival style. Now, Greek Revival style we see all over buildings in the first few decades of the United States. We see them first in public buildings, as I mentioned, banks, courthouses. So here we have the Second Bank of the United States and Stephen Girard's Bank, both in Philadelphia. Here we have the Custom House in New York from a little bit later. And it's no accident that we see banks having this style, because the other thing about Greek Revival that we can identify is that it's very much associated with this period in the early 19th century, where we see the emergence of market capitalism, specifically in the United States. And as a result, one of the major places we see Greek Revival architecture in the domestic area is in upstate New York, across the so-called burned over district, where we see a lot along the path of the Erie Canal, which was a site of this kind of bringing rural communities into a national market system during this period, and also was the site of a second great awakening, religious revival. And so it's interesting that we also see this kind of Greek Revival architecture being distinctive of that period. But as I said, we can also locate Greek Revival all over the United States. So here we see it, and not just domestic architecture, but theaters, courthouses, churches. We see it in New England, in the Midwest. Here's some examples from Indiana. And here's some examples from Oregon. So all the way in the Pacific Northwest. So we can see that this style sort of sweeps across the United States throughout the antebellum period and beyond. We also see Greek Revival appearing not only in architecture, but also in dress, and then also in interior furnishings. And we see this kind of across, especially in the 1820s and 1830s, we see this in a lot of, higher end homes. This is a merchant's house from New York. This is from 1837. This is a vision of the interior. And you can see both the moldings, the Greek style moldings around the doorways, and then of course the pillars the Ionic columns there in the back with the entablature represented in the molding of the wall. And then also you can see along the fireplace some Greek statue relief as well. Now we see Greek and Roman motifs. I mentioned the eagle and those earlier. We also see these Grecian motifs. So we see things like this kind of candlestick fragment in the form of a column. We also see the acanthus leaf being used extensively in moldings and also decorative motifs on furniture. And you kind of see this Greek revival parlor down in the right-hand corner. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And we even see Greek-style chairs there with the armless chairs there down there in the corner. Here we have the acanthus leaf as kind of a decorative motif in this mahogany table. We also see, again, the use of urns, Grecian urns, as decorative motif in furnishings. And then also we see shield-back chairs and harp images, shield images, also as part of furnishings, ornamentation, and design. Here's a mirror which has a Greek revival temple cornice at the top of it. And we also see the repetition of these motifs across other forms of material culture in pottery. And also here we have the urn, the Grecian urn, and the eagle together in a drinking glass and in a monumental ritual commemorative vase. So we kind of see these motifs all across various aspects of material life, and kind of embedded in everyday life. So how does this neoclassical style as the style of the new American Republic really get started? Well, we can locate part of its origins in the thought of Thomas Jefferson, who advocated for a neoclassical style as representative of the new American nation. And we see here two examples of his handiwork in the University of Virginia and Monticello. Again, we see the pediment, the portico, the columns, again, this very specific manifestation of that Greek temple imagery. In Jefferson's mind, and in the mind of many early Americans, this called to mind associations with Republican civic virtue. But as Lyra Montero points out, this was not a neutral idea. In what she calls racial classicism, she points out that this was implicitly carried with it racial understandings. This pervasive presence of the classical world in the early United States was also part of the creation of a white national identity, using Greece and Rome as a historical origin point from which the United States could see to be in part of that lineage. So this national identity rooted in classical antiquity was fundamentally a racially exclusive one. So even though race was a relatively new idea, right? It's a modern idea. It's not something that we see in the classical world. White Americans kind of adopted this as a category and mapped it back onto ancient Greece and Rome, claiming that the great thinkers and leaders of antiquity were their racial and political ancestors, affirming a kind of ancient nobility, a capacity for rule, and also, not uncoincidentally, offering a model of righteous empire and civilized slave ownership alongside democracy. So we can see that, in fact, this is an interesting moment of national identity formation, which has within it coded racial understandings. And thus, we can also identify Greek revival as the dominant style in the architecture of the antebellum period, and particularly of plantation homes. Here we have 3 examples from Georgia and Louisiana, and even manifest to some extent in the vernacular styles of Southern housing. All of these always painted white with a pillared porch. And this whiteness of these buildings has multiple associations with whiteness, racial whiteness, with whiteness as a kind of domination over nature, the obvious artificiality of the building and its rationality over dominating over nature, and then also with the kind of the white, supposedly white Greek temples of antiquity. And as Montero points out, this kind of pillared Greek revival style has also become recently the backdrop for articulations of white supremacy. And so here we have some examples of monuments, most of which have been, I think all of which have been taken down now. And then, of course, the incident in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I think that the associations of this have become even more pronounced after the Trump administration created this federal mandate in December of 2020 that all future government buildings should be in this classical, neoclassical style. It never really got any traction because it was the end of the administration, but in this executive order, the administration was explicitly making connections between these white columned classical buildings, beauty, and patriotism. So there you have it, Neoclassicism in the United States, the first national style. And again, it kind of shows us how these fashions in style can be not just the results of a kind of a cycle of change that we associate with modernity, but also can encode within them deeper ideological statements and positions of power.